Good evening, everyone. My name is Mira Devoda. I am the Voter Campaign Manager at the ACLU of Delaware. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm really excited to be here tonight. Thank you for joining us for the last of our Ballot Power webinar series focused on voting rights, and a very timely one because early voting opens today, which we'll talk about a little bit more in depth throughout this conversation, and also give you insight into a lot of different ways that you can choose to cast your ballots this season. So before we get started, I'm going to give each of our panelists a moment to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about the work they do. So Claire, do you mind kicking us off?
I'd be delighted. First of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. I'm Claire Snyder-Hall. I'm the Executive Director of Common Cause Delaware. And Common Cause Delaware is part of a national organization with over 1.5 million members. And we focus on ways of strengthening and protecting democracy. And one of those main ways is protecting the freedom to vote. We also work on money in politics and ethics and transparency and so forth. But the freedom to vote has been front and center recently. And that's, of course, what we're talking about tonight.
Thank you, Claire. Joanne, do you mind giving us a little intro?
Sure. Hi, Mira. It's a pleasure to be with everyone tonight. It's a great reunion of sorts because so many folks here are involved with the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition, which we started back after the 2020 elections. My name is Dwayne Bensing, he, him. I am the legal director of the ACLU of Delaware. In that role, I have helped facilitate some of our voting rights advocates across the state to work on some of the reforms we'll talk about tonight. But also think about some litigation strategies moving forward so that we can advance the right to vote and protect that right throughout the state of Delaware.
Thank you, Joanne. Joanne, do you mind giving us an intro?
Sure, and thanks for inviting me, Mira. I've joined fairly recently to the coalition, but it's been great. My name's Joanne Kingsley. I work for CLASSY, the Community Legal Aid Society. We're a nonprofit, non-political law firm that provides free civil legal advice to people in marginalized communities and disadvantaged persons. I work within our disabilities law program, and I am the voting rights advocate for persons with disabilities. So in our role, one of the parts of the Help America Vote Act set up something called a P&A system, which is a protection and advocacy. And in that, every state has an organization that is dedicated to the protection and advocacy of people with disabilities with regard to their access. And here in Delaware, CLASSY is that organization. So within that, I'm focused on the voting rights part.
Thank you, Joanne. And Rachel.
Yes, hi, I'm Rachel Carlson. I'm with PLAN, the Prisoners Legal Advocacy Network. I'm going in my last year of law school, and this past summer with PLAN, we really had a project that's continuing that focused in for system impacted voters in really every state, but including Delaware, and just what rights there are and also different barriers to access and to exercising those rights.
Thank you, Rachel. And our last panelist, we have a full house, Christina.
Hi, Mira, and thank you so much for inviting me. My name is Christina. I am a Smart Justice Ambassador with Smart Justice Delaware. I am big on voting rights and here to discuss some of the things that I've experienced firsthand in my work with Smart Justice and the ACLU.
Thank you, Christina. And it's really amazing just to have our campaigns overlap and to have Smart Justice representation here as well. So I really appreciate you joining us. Priya just mentioned in the chat that anyone who is viewing right now can drop questions in the chat or in the Q&A section throughout our conversation, and we will be sure to answer any questions that come up for you at the end of our panel discussion. So you can do that at any moment throughout this conversation. All right, we're going to go ahead and jump right into it. So I'm going to give a little background on our first question and then open it up to the floor. So in 2021, so last year, more than 440 bills attempting to restrict voting rights were introduced across the country. However, Delaware bucked this nationwide trend and instead passed a series of victories for expanded access to the ballot. So the question for our panelists would be, can you elaborate on these voting rights wins, what they are, and what they mean for this upcoming election season? That's free for anyone.
There's so much to talk about. I don't know why there was any delay there. I think Delaware really did buck the trend. We had huge advancements this last session. And, I think I'll start with the one that's most timely, because today is the first day of early voting in Delaware. This is the first time that Delawareans may show up and vote in person early at early voting locations. So I like to think of elections as election seasons. You don't wait, those who celebrate Christmas don't wait until Christmas Day to put up the Christmas tree. You celebrate the whole month of December. So there's no reason to wait on your casting your ballot, and there's no reason that you have to do that anymore in Delaware. So early voting has passed, and this is the first election where we have statewide folks are able to early vote. Those who are registered to vote in the primary election and upcoming in the general, that'll be open as well. So I'm really excited about early voting being an opportunity for folks in 2022. And let's let some other folks talk, because there are two other really great bills that passed this session.
Okay, I'll take that opportunity. Yeah, it's really fantastic that we have early voting starting, and we also had 3 other victories this session with automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration, and vote by mail. I'm organizing election protection in Delaware, and it really struck me how significant same-day voter registration is, because that bill essentially eliminates registration deadlines. And so if somebody shows up at the polls and they're not registered for some reason or whatever, or they moved, it's not this complicated thing anymore. It's going to be, you go in there and you can update your record that very day and then vote, or you can register to vote and vote. So it's not this bizarre thing where you have to be, weeks ahead, thinking about how you're going to vote. So I'm really excited about same-day registration.
Well, as well, for persons with disabilities, I think early voting can really open up some avenues for access that just didn't exist before. A lot of folks with disabilities really would prefer to vote in person, although they have other options. But for some folks, depending on the type of disability they have, getting to a busy polling station on election day, where there's a long line that comes all the way out of the building, wraps around the corner, and you have to wait in line sometimes for hours until it's your turn to get up there. And that's just not possible for a lot of our elderly people or anyone with a mobility issue, a pregnant woman. I mean, for a lot of folks, is that long wait is really hard or impossible, or they can't miss work. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why having 10 whole days, and one of them being weekend days, as well as early morning to 7 in the afternoon, is fantastic. It's my hope that a lot more people with disabilities will have that option to go and vote in person without having to deal with, like I said, those long lines and the long waits in order to cast their ballots.
And of course, the more people who vote early, that takes the pressure off of the official election day, because there'll be less people going to the polls, and people don't even have to go to the polls because they have the option to vote from home through the vote by mail system, which is really exciting. Gives people another option.
Yeah, I was going to say, to Joanne's point, Delaware voters who had an excuse, like folks with disabilities, have been able to cast a ballot by mail through the absentee voting process for decades in Delaware. And that process has been widely used by folks who have an excuse. In 2020, obviously, we faced the pandemic, and the legislature responded by allowing emergency legislation to allow folks to vote by mail. And in the 2020 election, 160,000 Delawareans decided, hey, you know what? I'd rather cast this ballot from the comfort and convenience of my own home. And luckily, our General Assembly responded and said, hey, we need to make this a permanent fixture of our voting methods in Delaware and expand that for everyone, whether you have an excuse or not, whether you're in Delaware on election day or not, you can cast your mail ballot. So mail ballot is now universal. A lot of folks might think, oh, don't I need an excuse to request that mail ballot? No, not anymore. We have vote by mail universally permitted in Delaware. So take your time, get your application in, get your ballot returned in time. It has to get back to the Department of Elections by the close of election day, but definitely take the time to review your ballot from the comfort of your home.
And also, just as a caveat, if you are doing a vote by mail or absentee ballot, if you're going to use a drop box, the drop boxes are at the Department of Elections offices. They're not at every polling place. So just keep that in mind as well.
Thank you. I actually realized when I had originally written these questions, we did not have vote by mail signed into law. So I am really glad that we are able to talk about that right now. And yes, Dwayne, do you want to add in a note about automatic voter registration as well? I feel like it doesn't always make headlines, but it's worth mentioning.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about it unless Rachel or Christina want to jump in. I think one of the great benefits of automatic voter registration is that it really gets folks on the front lines who are already communicating with the Delaware government, particularly at the driver's license, when you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles to get your driver's license or update your license and registration, all of that. Now, any of those interactions, once this automatic voter registration takes effect, those interactions will trigger automatic voter registration. So that's going to be a really great tool for our Department of Elections to get better information about registered voters in Delaware, their current addresses, to make sure that they can send them their information that they need about where their polling location is and update their voter registration rolls. And so, we used to have this archaic system where you'd have to fill out a registration form, a certain number of days in advance when people aren't even thinking about elections. They're thinking about, picking their kids up from school and other important things. And now it's just automatic. If you're doing business with the state will register you to vote. And if you, forget, show up on election day, bring your ID or other form to show where you live. And that's what same-day registration is all about. So 2 methods of really cleaning up what used to be a really complicated message.
Yeah. And I'd just like to add that vote by mail is also a big advantage for people with disabilities, because it's actually a bit of a misleading to say that people with disabilities can vote absentee. It's only people with physical disabilities, as stated in the Constitution. So people with any kind of mental intellectual disability do not have that same right. They do not have the ability to vote absentee. And so again, while many would prefer to vote in person, this gives them an option now where they don't have to provide any kind of excuse. On the other hand, our interaction with the process is with the whole process, not just with like election day or the method. But for example, the ID thing is still a big hurdle, in particular for people with disabilities, because there's no way to obtain it remotely. You have to physically go there. And that's a real challenge for people who are institutionalized, for people who have mobility issues, and still because of COVID, or people who are otherwise immune compromised, going out into public again and having to do this still presents a challenge. And so I'm hopeful that this will still be on our agenda for, on our wish list still for our legislature to look at these issues of ID and access to that, or making the ID more accessible, or having mobile units that can come to the different facilities and help people get that ID.
Joanne, that's a really excellent point and really digs into the nuances of who qualifies for absentee ballots. And Delaware is quite strict about it, which is why this vote by mail push is so important for so many different voters. We are actually going to kind of transition. We're going to head back to these voting changes a little bit later on, but we're going to move to a pretty important topic, prison voting. So in Delaware, thousands of people are disenfranchised every election because they are incarcerated or on probation. So this is kind of a two-part question here. And the first part being, what type of barriers remain for system-involved individuals who wish to exercise their fundamental right to vote? And Christina, I would love you to take the lead on that question if you're comfortable.
Certainly, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk on this. So I'm a big numbers person. So to start with, when you say thousands, I think it's really important that people understand in Delaware, we have an incarceration rate of approximately 630 for every 100,000 residents. That is one of the highest incarceration rates in the entire country per capita. So when we talk about the thousands of people who are disenfranchised, we're talking about approximately 20,000 Delaware residents with every election. And over 50% of them have not been convicted of anything and are still eligible to vote. So I believe that some of the major barriers that still come into play have to do with misinformation. A lot of people don't realize that they're even eligible to vote. And it's kind of difficult to get that information put out appropriately, because we don't have full cooperation. So main barrier is just not being aware that they are still able to vote. We also have a large population of incarcerated individuals who are sentenced due to misdemeanors. Again, still eligible, still able to vote, and are not aware of this. They believe that because they've been convicted, they are not eligible to vote. So I think that, that the information channels are really the biggest barrier that still exists. Automatic voter registration and vote by mail, no excuse vote by mail has definitely helped to eliminate some of the major barriers that were previously in place. But we've got to fight the information barrier that still exists.
Some of those barriers are the same for people who are institutionalized for other reasons. And some of them, when they're pre-trial, if they've been deemed to have some kind of mental or physical disability, they're actually in a mental institution until such time as they go to trial. And so that's a big point that Class C works on in our disabilities law program, to also have access to them, ensure that they can register or re-register, update their information. And we provide registration ourselves. We can register people in these institutions, and we can also help them or train the staff at that facility to help them fill their absentee or vote by mail ballots when that time comes. So a lot of the same challenges, not quite as rough, but still we face a lot of that.
But I mean, that's not the same in the prisons, right? I mean, they don't let people go in and register, and they don't let people vote by absentee ballot, and they don't let people cast a ballot, is my understanding.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know a huge barrier that a lot of the people that we've worked with, especially over the summer, has just been access to exercise their rights. Individuals who are pre-trial, who don't have one of the disqualifying felony convictions in the past that would unfortunately keep them from voting in Delaware, they have that right. And just how do they even exercise that right? How do they get a ballot? How do they fill out registration? There are certain pieces of ID that you need for that, and you need to have access to that. And a lot of that falls to what is the facility willing and able to provide to you, just again, to be able to fully exercise what is your right. And then there's certainly other changes that have been going on that are concerning, with even changes to mail policies, where there are prisons that are moving towards digitizing mail, and so all mail is sent out to another facility, it's scanned in, and then those who are incarcerated can access it electronically. But then how does that impact being able to vote with an absentee ballot? And you need to be able to, again, have access to that ballot, to filling it out, to being able to mail it back, and keeping it all so that the ballot isn't spoiled in any way, so that it can be correctly processed and read and counted. So definitely to go off of Christina's point of misinformation, we have certainly seen that there is a lot of misinformation given as to what are your rights, especially for currently incarcerated individuals, because they have such limited access to that information. Oftentimes it's whatever is made available in the facility by the facility. So then trying to ensure that that information is correct. And then again, being able to fully exercise those rights. It's just, it has certainly been an ongoing issue and barrier. And then even outside of incarceration, having accurate information as to when somebody is eligible to vote, completing any kind of supervision, parole, probation, and it's not that they had one of the disqualifying felony charges, felony convictions. So being able to know that now they are eligible, and again, being able to go and register and have that information.
I mean, just the whole concept of, I mean, people take it for granted, this idea that people who are in prison shouldn't be able to vote, which is, I mean, to me, really absurd. You know, just because you commit a crime or you do something wrong, your punishment is, you know, a prison sentence or whatever, but that doesn't mean you're banished from society and stripped of, you know, all membership, right? I mean, these folks are still part of society. And I don't really even understand the whole mentality that you shouldn't be able to vote if you're incarcerated, you know, even if you have committed, you know, a crime. Felony.
Yeah. Go ahead, Christina, sorry.
I was just going to say, you know, to Claire's point, like for me, it goes even a little farther, right? You know, a huge percentage of Delaware prison population are individuals that are there for low-level drug offenses, like small possession of marijuana. And, you know, it's a very systemic and purposeful disenfranchisement. And it's been increasing as opposed to decreasing. So I feel like it's really important to kind of, you know, bring this back up, right? You know, what is it? 87% of individuals in prison for low-level drug offenses are Black Delawareans. So, you know, it's all very intentional, and something that, you know, we can all come together to put an end to reverse that, to fix the misinformation, to get the access there. But it's also like, you know, for me, we have to acknowledge the intent, and that it was done intentionally. Sorry about that, Dwayne.
No, I love that. That's even a better segue for what I would want to talk about. I mean, I think that that's exactly right. We have to have a reckoning about why do we have these kinds of restrictions, and Christina's point about the racial disparities in our prison systems. This is on purpose, right? This is by design, a history of systemic racism and disenfranchisement that continues to create obstacles for people of color to exercise their right to vote in this country. And to what Claire was saying a little bit earlier, you know, this is a state by state situation. States really get to govern who gets to vote and those eligibility requirements. There is a federal floor, but unfortunately, the current Supreme Court just keeps lowering that floor for what are the guarantees on our most fundamental right in this democracy. And so that's, you know, that's really frustrating, but it also should be encouraging to us to work so hard to make sure that Delaware works hard to guarantee the right to vote for as many people who are eligible as possible. And you know, a lot of studies have been done about this idea that because it is so state by state specific, this lack of information that Christina has talked about really has a trickle out effect and impacts entire communities. The Brennan Center has a great study showing how the disenfranchisement, the permanent disenfranchisement of people due to certain kinds of felonies has a trickle out effect, making others assume that they are ineligible to vote, even though they've completed their probation sentence and would otherwise be eligible in the state of Delaware. So this patchwork of state by state laws, where in some states, a felony means you're forever disenfranchised, and in other states people can cast a ballot from their prison cell. This patchwork is really confusing for folks, and it makes us as advocates have to work even harder to educate folks. But it's why we have to work with our Department of Elections and our Department of Corrections to allow folks in to give the information to people who are eligible and incarcerated, and make sure they have the opportunity. And we talked about how easy it is to register to vote earlier. It's not that easy if you're incarcerated in Delaware. You have to get that form, you have to get the form of ID, and you have to set up an appointment with a counselor to get that copy of your ID. You have to get it through the prison mail system, which is clumsy at best. Those are all frustrating obstacles for folks who are presently incarcerated.
And as I mentioned earlier, we look at the whole process, not just voting day. And part of that process for prisoners as well is access to information. How are you possibly going to know who the candidates are and what their positions are on the issues in order to cast a vote? If you don't have access to information, to news, to be able to discuss, you also have some privacy. The vote is supposed to be private. All of those things get taken away. And so that ability to vote requires accessibility to information as well as to the ballot itself or the registration form.
Rachel, I see you're unmuted. Did you have something to add in there?
No, the only thing I was going to add was exactly what Christina was saying, that, and Dwayne, that this is intentional. Again, these are especially for people who are incarcerated pre-trial for often very low-level offenses. You're looking at the bail system, and it comes down to ability to pay your bail or not, whether then you're going to be incarcerated pre-trial or not, oftentimes, and so many other factors as well. So absolutely with that. And then again, even just kind of noting off of all of it, in other states, it varies so much. So there are states where you can be serving a felony sentence and incarcerate and still have the right to vote. And not only that, but it's being done in other states where you can actually vote. They will set it up. So there are polling centers in prisons. So this isn't some completely foreign concept that's never been done. It's being done other places. So certainly to just continue to push for people to be able to exercise their rights is just really important.
I appreciate that, Rachel. And it leads really well into the next question, which all of you really touched on throughout that conversation. But I want to make this very clear, since we are going to be casting ballots either today, in the next 10 days, or on the 13th. So when we head to the polls or when we cast our ballot by mail, what should we look for in elected officials who are willing to champion prison voting as an issue, to champion, I'm tripping on my words here, to champion the end of felony disenfranchisement, all of these issues? What are some of the policies and qualities of candidates that should be at the front of our mind when we cast our ballots?
So I'll jump really quick on that one. I think that we really need to be paying attention to what the candidates are doing for us right off of the bat. So for example, ACLU, gives candidates a survey. Check to see if the candidate has even bothered to complete the survey, right? Because these surveys are coming from us, we the people. So I think that's just right off of the bat, like no ties to anything there. Just that should be one of the big things that we're looking at. What has this candidate ever done for others around them, versus, oh, they're a small business owner or they're associated or affiliated with XYZ. what volunteer stuff have they done? What activities have they done? Have they ever stepped foot inside of a Delaware prison? Have they ever spoken to somebody who was formerly incarcerated? So on and so forth. But then I also think that, coming straight out and just asking candidates how they feel about legislating polling places inside of the prisons, how they feel about legislating a requirement of cooperation between prison officials and election officials in order to make access to ballots and voting information and candidate information more readily available. Just some really short, quick, easy things that we can be looking at.
Yeah, I wanted to say as well, we are working on there's now a coalition of groups that deal with disability that are looking to interview candidates about their positions on various issues related to disability. And Christina, like you, I like my numbers too. They've helped me to understand the magnitude of the problem. When I started looking at this kind of nationwide, I was astonished to find out Rutgers does a study every 2 years of what happened in the most recent round. And in 2020, there were 38 million eligible voters with disabilities. 38 million. That's bigger than the Black vote. It's bigger than the Hispanic vote. And yet, if you ask almost any candidate, what are your policies related to disabilities? Or if you ask, what is your position on diversity and equity and inclusion? And they'll immediately go usually to race and gender. And it's like, well, what about disability? Do you have any disabled staff? Are you aware of any of the issues? And I think a lot of candidates don't understand how many people in Delaware. It's enormous. It's 186,592 people. That's 1 in 4 adults in Delaware. 1 in 4. And I didn't realize it until I really dug into the numbers, just how big this problem is. The sad part of these numbers is that less than half of people eligible, voters with disabilities, voted. And so I'm also encouraging people with disabilities to register to participate, because if they can get their numbers up, this is a huge voting block that has the possibility to change the outcomes of an election or a certain policy. And so, and it's not just education candidates. I think it's education for all of us. It certainly has been educational for me. I'm not an expert in this. I've been fairly newly recruited into this position, so there's been a big learning curve for me. And yeah, I'm just coming to grips with the magnitude of this population and all the many challenges that they face in the whole process.
Thank you, Joanne, for bringing that point up, and that gives us a really good transition into our next question as well, which is just really a clarifying question based on what you just added in. So, as you said, we need to see solutions here. Can you give us a little bit more insight into what solutions the Department of Elections can champion, or advocacy organizations like the ones that we're a part of, to increase awareness of this issue, because it is so often overlooked?
Sure, you'll just have to warn me to stop talking.
Don't worry, I will.
I had mentioned internally to the group that we've done a survey of the early voting sites to make sure that they are accessible for people with disabilities. And this is new. We haven't had early voting before, and these are not your usual polling places. These are new centers that people are going to that they've never visited before. And I was all of us at Class C were quite alarmed to find a lot of them really don't measure up. There's a lack of parking for people with disabilities, or they're the old parking with no space for the ramps or the elevated things that they have. The doors are too narrow to fit a wheelchair, or the parking lot is sloped like this, so you couldn't even get out of your car safely. This is stuff I hadn't expected. Now, we've shared all this information, and the Department of Elections has been excellent and very responsive in acknowledging the information we've shared and saying that it is their responsibility. We're looking forward to see what measures they will take in order to do that. But as I said, because we look at the whole process, starting with ID, if you don't have a driver's license and you don't have a state ID, the only thing you can use to register is your social security number. And I don't know about you guys, when somebody asks me for my social security number, my first answer is no. Why do you need it? And they can I understand they can just give the last 4 digits, but still, that feels intrusive. It's like, why does the Department of Elections need my social security number? And so that issue, the hurdle of identification, has got to be addressed, whether it's with mobile units that can go to prisons, to hospitals, to nursing homes, to places where people don't have access to get that ID, because voter ID is coming up in every single state, and I think it will continue to come up in Delaware. So for me, it's got to start there. But the information flow is part of it as well. As I said, if people, if they're institutionalized or they just, they're at home, but because of mobility issues or health issues that prevent them from going out very often, how do they get information? And is it in an accessible format? So much is done on the internet. Part of the Rutgers study looked at how many people with disabilities have access to the internet, whether they're at home or institutionalized. And I think COVID showed us that an awful lot of neighborhoods in this country have no internet or very unreliable internet. And so their kids weren't able to attend classes. So, there's a whole lot of things we need to look at, and is stuff on the screen legible? Are there closed captionings for those, that are deaf? Is our internet accessible, or is it in colors that people can't see? So, it's tip of the iceberg. There's a lot to look at.
Thank you, Joanne. And I know for our audience, it kind of feels like we're jumping all around here, but really all of these issues are so interconnected and work together that we can't have this conversation without hitting on all of these points. So it really it does highlight the intersectionality here and how some of these issues span such large arrays of conversations. So we are it's going to sound like a transition, but it's all related here. Moving off that conversation of legislation and what changes were needed, we're going to pivot to talk about the Voting Rights Act, or the VRA of 1965. I'm going to give you a little bit of background just so that our viewers can understand what the Voting Rights Act is if you're not familiar with it. And then we'll jump into the conversation. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was one of the most significant pieces of voting rights legislation in US history. It took huge steps towards breaking down barriers to voting on the basis of race or ethnicity. However, in June of 2013, the US Supreme Court struck down Section 5 of the VRA, what had been called its heart, and most recently, a second US Supreme Court decision significantly limited Section 2 of the VRA, both sections that protected against racial discrimination. So Rachel, I'm going to throw it to you here to start us off with what the implications of this decision is, of these decisions are, and what kind of constitutional amendments we might need to see from this.
Yeah, and definitely from a constitutional amendment perspective, and kind of tying in legislative action that can be done to this conversation, would be looking at amendments to end felony disenfranchisement. Again, when you really think about the reasoning for this, we're all part of a community, and just because somebody has a certain conviction, why are they now excluded from their community that they're a part of? And again, when you look at more of a nationwide perspective, there are many states where there is no felony disenfranchisement. You retain your right to vote. And that can be whether you're incarcerated, whether a sentence has been completed, you can still vote and be a part of your community. And you're able to vote on systems that impact your life and your family's lives and your loved ones. And you're really part of the constituency then for those different elected officials. And that's really what the perspective needs to be, that you are part of this community, you do have that voice. So again, kind of tying in that legislative piece, looking at who is, when are candidates willing to look at this? Are they willing to propose this and take steps to move forward on it? Because it is something that is not across the board in the United States. It's very different in every state. And not every state excludes members from their society. So it's something that we should be looking at.
Mira, I'll just pick up there and kind of going back to the Voting Rights Act and why that relates to the constitutional amendment that Rachel was just talking about, is it goes back to this fundamental issue that race matters, and that race is kind of the undercurrent of a lot of these voter restrictions that we have. And it's really too bad that our Supreme Court did overturn sections of the Voting Rights Act to really undermine some of those accessibility issues. But our hands aren't completely tied. And what we've seen happen at the state level, most recently in New York, is you can pass state voting rights acts that really protect minority voters to make sure that they have access to the ballot, that any changes in access or restrictions on voting go through a pre-clearance program that puts the burden on the government to say, why are these voting changes happening, and to ensure that they don't harm voters of color before they go into effect. And really just expanding language assistance for voters with limited English proficiency. That's a piece of a Voting Rights Act that we really need to think about, especially as our immigrant population grows in Delaware. Again, stronger laws against voter intimidation, deception, obstruction. We think about all the, fake news and the social media that we have these days. Those can really play up some of these deceptive practices, and we have to have a tool to fight back to make sure that people are provided correct information about voting and access. And really our courts have to be good players in this, right? We have to have the legislature pass rules to tell our courts, listen, we need to interpret our laws as broadly as possible to ensure that voters have access. We need to interpret our laws to be pro-democracy, pro-voter access, rather than restricting those ways. So those are just a few ways that we can do a state level Voting Rights Act to really ensure those same kinds of protections that we used to have at the federal level are still protected here in Delaware.
If I could just add one thing to that. I absolutely agree, Dwayne, but also the federal voting rights legislation is important, because I think a lot of times, we started this conversation out by talking about the fantastic progress we've made here in Delaware on voting rights. But, we can't be too content that, we're doing the right thing, because with the 440 bills that have been introduced across the country to systematically disenfranchise voters, particularly voters of color, people who live in cities, young voters, first-time voters, that if those states go that way with voter suppression and sabotage, that's going to affect Delaware. Right? I mean, we can't be a blue bubble. Well, I shouldn't say blue. we can't be a pro-voter bubble in a fascist, anti-voter country, right? And it affects the presidency and Congress, and that affects us. And so, we have to also have energy around things like the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. But that's not to say that I don't totally support what Dwayne was saying about also working for, Voting Rights Act in Delaware.
Well, and so to kind of go to both your point and to Dwayne's point here. So we have state level things that we can do, right, that also encompass federal regulations. So like, for example, under, Section 7 of the National Voter Registration Act, we can legislate to designate jails as, formal registration sites. I mean, we have the ability to legislate out a lot of these intentional disenfranchisements. It's about getting the right candidates in that understand, what's being done, why it's being done, and how we can, how that legislation can correct that. I think it's really important, though, again, back to the numbers, right, to talk about, Delaware being such a small population, right? We have less than 1 million people in our state. You have roughly 30% of a turnout when it comes to Black Delawareans. And the main reasons for this are systemic disenfranchisement, right? So we only see so many of one population, then that should be an indication, right, for our legislators to start looking at why is this happening. But we don't see a whole lot of that with our current legislation or legislature. So just, you know, it to me, it goes so much deeper, right? Like I said, about 30% of the Black population in Delaware comes out to vote. But when you look at, you know, just in 2020 alone, there were 4 polling locations in the city of Wilmington that were closed. And they were closed within a month before the elections. So now you have people that likely don't drive, may not have any way to get to another polling location. Their new polling location may be 15 or 20 miles from where they're currently living. So there's a lot. So I feel like, you know, legislation wise, right? Like we have a lot of opportunity. We just need to get the right people in there that care to take it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. I just really want to emphasize how voting rights spans so many different issues. We've talked about smart justice issues. We've talked about prison voting. We've talked about disability rights. Voting rights really just spans the full array of all of the issues that we work on. And it's a conversation that really interjects itself into so many others as well. We're going to kind of start to wrap up our conversation now. I do still want to open it up. If you've had a question throughout this event that you didn't get a chance to stick in the chat, please go ahead and do it. But I want to give our panelists a platform to talk about next steps, what you can do from here, and some action items for our viewers and for anyone who you might speak to after this. So I'm going to throw it to Claire first, who's going to tell us a little bit about election protection, and if this is a conversation that you got really interested in, what you can do next to get involved.
Yes, thank you. Voting is so important. I mean, it's the foundation of our entire system of government. And we've talked about a lot of issues that are really important. But one thing I want to let people know is that for the first time this year, Delaware is putting on the ground an election protection program that's going to put poll monitors at the polls. And the poll monitor program is a nonpartisan effort. It's part of a national movement that started after the 2000 election that puts independent, nonpartisan volunteers outside the polls to help assist voters who, if you think about Delaware, could be confused about their polling location after redistricting. They could be confused about what it means that we have all these new voting rules like same-day voter registration and so forth. Or there could also be, and I hope this doesn't happen, there could be outbreaks of anti-voter extremism, because although we're not going that way overall, we still have pockets of folks who want to curtail the freedom to vote in Delaware. And so we need to have eyes and ears on the ground. And so if anyone wants to help out, and I hear it's really fun, I know it's going to be fun, protectthevote.net. I'll put it in the chat, protectthevote.net. Just go there, sign up. It's a national website. I'll drop your name into the Delaware spreadsheet, and you can either help out in the primary or the general election, and you will, training and everything you need will be provided. So hopefully some folks will volunteer for this program and have a good showing for the first state this year.
Can definitely vouch for Claire. Anyone who gets to work with her is lucky. So I did just drop the link in the chat for anyone who's interested in signing up. Please share it with your networks as well. I do want to highlight a few other next steps you can take in terms of how you can cast your ballot. So like we said, today is the start of early voting. So I'd like to open it up to our panelists to kind of walk our viewers through what steps they can take to cast their ballot early, what resources they can use, and where to find that information. So if somebody wants to jump onto that conversation, please. I can also do it, but.
Yeah, so head to votede.org for one. Lots of really great resources there. ACLU page has a lot of really great resources. as well as the Smart Justice page does as well. You also have a lot of, voter empowerment groups, League of Women Voters, and a few others. If somebody else has some names that they want to spit out there, but there's a lot of available resources and things for us to get involved with.
Absolutely. And Marge, thank you for dropping that in the chat as well. We do have the League of Women Voters site up. I'm going to drop it right here too. That has a lot of incredible information. So yes, you can find everything that you need to cast your ballot early on these websites. And I do want to also give us a chance to talk about vote by mail a little bit more in depth, because it might sound like a confusing process. It might sound different or difficult, but we really want to make sure that that process is as easy and straightforward for you as possible. So Joanne, Joanne, Rachel, Claire, anyone who wants to hop on here and talk about how our viewers can submit their ballots by mail.
Yeah, I'll start off with that. Vote by mail is a great option for persons with disabilities for a lot of reasons. And one is not just for people with disabilities, it's for everyone, particularly in Kent and Sussex County. Transportation, public transportation is a big issue. We're far more spread out on here. And public transportation is far less than what it is in Newcastle County. And paratransit, any kind of transportation that can accommodate wheelchairs and other assistive equipment, is very limited. They don't work nights or weekends. They won't wait for you. There's very few of them. And so it's as much as people would like to vote in person, the vote by mail gives a simple way. You have to request it first, which you can do online, by mail, or by calling your county office. Very simple process. And then literally you fill it out, you get a postage paid envelope to send it back, or you can drop it off at one of these secure drop boxes that there are, I believe, 4 around the state. And they're all listed on all of these websites. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that Classy will also be doing poll monitoring inside and out for accessibility for all of our folks with disabilities. And we also have a hotline. So if people run into trouble at the polls, they can call us, and we have attorneys standing by, and we can provide assistance right then and there.
Is that the 866-R-VOTE hotline?
No, it's my direct phone. It's
oh, okay.
Yes,
because there's also the 866-R-VOTE hotline run by the lawyers.
There are many.
Yeah. So and also other language hotlines as well that aren't in English.
Yes, exactly.
Absolutely. And all of those resources that we've just discussed are outlined on all of the websites that we've dropped in the chat for you, as well as our full Delaware Voting Rights Coalition voter guide, which just launched earlier last week. It outlines all of these processes for you in simple, straightforward ways, and also links all of the resources that we previously discussed as well. You can feel free to print those guides out, email them, share them on your networks, upload them to your social pages. And if you visit the ACLU homepage or Vote Delaware, you can also download graphics to use on your social channels as well to really uplift that guide and make sure that as many people as possible are able to view it. So that's kind of the end of our conversation. We've given you some information on how you can cast your ballot next, what you can do, sign up for election protection, check out our websites and resources. And of course, we're always all here as a resource for you as well, and as people to answer your questions too. So I will just open it up to our panelists for any last comments that you want to make or any points that you wanted to hit before we close out here.
I guess just the one thing I would say is that, we've talked about voter turnout being low, and in the primaries, it often is low, but the primaries are incredibly important, particularly because a lot of the districts, the primary is the general election. And we have very uncompetitive elections in the general election in Delaware. So, just because it's the primary, that's when it matters. I had a friend who just asked me, does it matter that I'm not registered with a party and therefore I can't vote in the primary and just the general election? I said, yeah, it matters because the primary is super important. So don't forget to vote on September 13th or before. Early voting, vote by mail. It's critical.
Yep, I'll double down on that and say Justin Dart is a gentleman who is acknowledged as being the father of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And he's well known for saying, vote as if your life depended on it, because it does.
Okay. Christina, I saw that you almost unmuted there. Did you have a final comment to add in?
I actually was gonna
Please.
bring up the same quote that Joanne just brought up. So yeah, vote like your life depends on it, because it absolutely does.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your experiences today and for giving us some insights on such a wide array of issues and information. Like I said before, I know that your mind might be spinning because we talked about so many different things throughout this hour, but it is all located in writing on those resources that we shared for you. So not to end this conversation with saying voting is the solution to everything, but it is a step forward. It is a step that we take to get to that end solution. So we'll see you guys at the polls. If you have any questions about how you can vote, when you can vote, where you can vote, be sure to check out our resources or contact us directly. And a huge thank you to Priya as well, who does all the behind the scenes work to make this webinar series happen. So thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your evening. Happy voting.